Western Alliance Bank. Bridge Bank. Be bold, venture wisely.
Now, your 3-day weather forecast on Bloomberg 1130.
Plenty of clouds around tonight. Some late night clearing, breezy, and a low down near 30 degrees. Tomorrow becoming mostly sunny, breezy, high up near 40. Tomorrow night looking clear, low down near 25. Monday, sunshine, high near 45. Looking ahead towards Tuesday, more clouds than sun Tuesday. Chance for an afternoon shower and a high up near 45. That's your Bloomberg 3-day weather forecast. I'm Susanna Palmer. Now a check on Bloomberg Sports.
The Knicks and Nets have the night off. The Knicks have won 6 of 7, playing Detroit Sunday, while the Nets host the Thunder. Friday's game between the Spurs and Warriors at the Alamo Dome drew over 62,000, the largest crowd ever for an NBA regular season game. Golden State won by 31. NHL, the Islanders host the Canadiens while the Devils visit the Kings. NFL, the Giants meet the Vikings Sunday in a wild card matchup. The Vikings beat them 27-24 on Christmas Eve, and the Giants haven't won there since 2004. That's a Bloomberg Sports Update. I'm Joel Stern.
This is All Thoughts on Bloomberg Radio. I'm Tracy Alloway.
And I'm Joe Weisenthal. Today we're looking at the question of whether we can achieve a soft landing for the U.S. economy. Certain recent data suggests that we can. We're going to be speaking with Connor Sen of Bloomberg Opinion and Neil Dutta of Renaissance Macro. Neil, I want to go back to something you said in your first answer, because I don't troll on Twitter, but I do sometimes joke. Very, very convincing laugh there. But that falling gas prices are bad for inflation because falling gas prices mean more money in consumer pockets. More money in consumer pockets mean more spending power. More spending power means higher prices. But you kind of said that in your first answer. You're like, look, real wage growth with this decline in inflation is picking up. That makes it hard to get any kind of landing. So is there something where falling gas prices and a few other categories is not actually good news for inflation?
Well, I think it moves things in place, right? I mean, you're talking about relative price shifting, right? So if the labor markets are steady and people see, it's like saying, do you think a tax cut is inflationary? I think most macro models will probably say yes, right? So I think that the fact that gasoline prices are declining, all that does is shift consumer purchasing power to other areas of their, goods and services basket, and that drives up the prices for those goods and services. I don't think it has an overall impact on inflation, but again, the reason I think the Fed looks at it through the conduit of the labor markets is this identity, right? So much of economics is identity, whether you're talking about corporate profits or in this case, inflation. And for them, compensation equals inflation plus productivity. Powell has basically talked about that equation multiple times over the last year. And if the labor markets are tight and unemployment is 3.5%, that's going to keep compensation growth steady. And we're not particularly in a productivity environment right now. Productivity is notoriously hard to forecast, but it's not particularly strong, so that leaves a lot of pressure on inflation. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Fed's looking at the labor market so strongly. And by the way, a lot of the improvement in inflation that we're talking about right now has almost nothing to do with the Fed, right? That's part of the issue. Used car prices, supply chain improvement, it's not like people put their rent on the credit card. So the slowing in rental inflation has almost nothing to do with what's going on with the labor market or tightening credit or anything like that. It's just it's happening kind of independently, I think, of what the Fed is doing. So to me, the Fed's got some explaining to do.
Tracy, wasn't there some term we were using in 2021 about inflation coming down for reasons other than monetary policy?
Well, okay, this is my new conspiracy theory about financial conditions, which is I believe the Fed still thinks inflation is transitory and is actually comfortable with financial conditions not actually tightening that much because they think the things that are making prices go up are the transitory supply chain stuff. And so it's just, talk your way out of the period of adjustment without actually tightening too much that is constant recession. That's my new conspiracy theory. Okay, there's silence, so I guess no one else agrees with me. Okay, well, Connor, we talked a little bit, I think in private, about productivity, and you have seen companies come out and talk about the difficulty of replacing the older workforce that left during the pandemic, and we are having basically this productivity adjustment. How are you viewing that component of it? Because as Neil just mentioned, it is a tough thing to forecast, and so far all we seem to have is anecdotes about what companies are doing here.
Well, we know that labor market turnover has declined over the past 6 months at least, and companies say they're better staffed, they say they're in a better place. I think supply chains getting better is maybe kind of squishy, but helps at the margin. Things like being able to turn your capital faster because you're getting shipments more quickly and can sell them more quickly, so you're not waiting a long time for orders. But I think the challenge with productivity is, to Neil's point, there's this very standard model of real economic growth is hours worked plus productivity. But a lot of what's happening with real economic growth that we saw in 2022 and what we're seeing right now doesn't really fit into that framework very well. And for instance, you take the rental market, where we added 4+ million jobs in 2022, but actually new leases on rentals was negative in 2022 for the first time since 2009 because we unwound some of the excess household formation we got during the pandemic. As a result, rents are falling, and shelter is a huge part that goes into inflation. So inflation could come up very, very rapidly for sort of reasons unrelated to sort of standard business productivity, just due to sort of households deciding not to get new leases, maybe find roommates again. And I don't know if that's if people decide to get a roommate, is that productivity growth? Not really, but it also frees up capacity for other people. So I think this sort of standard way of thinking about productivity isn't very helpful at the moment.
So basically, Powell needs to go out and say, get a roommate, folks. If we could do this the hard way, more people lose their jobs, or the hard way, like get a roommate.
Well, I think
I hadn't thought about it before, but if two people share a space versus one, that is a kind of productivity growth, isn't it?
Yeah, and the scenario that's really weird for 2023, which I think is possible, is we know that sort of that core goods inflation is negative right now. So let's say that's 0 in 2023. And it tended to be pretty low heading into the pandemic. And then we know rent growth is negative at the moment. It was about -3% annualized in Q4 of 2022. What if the shelter component of CPI is just flat in 2023? And this is not assuming any job loss. It's just sort of due to these weird effects going on right now. And then that sort of core services ex-shelter component even costs 5% because maybe wage growth is still hot. That gets you to a core CPI number below 2%. And so you can have a soft landing with sub 2% core inflation in a good growth environment. I wouldn't say that's a new normal or anything, but that's what the data could show based on all these weird dynamics happening at the moment.
Neil?
I think it's totally plausible. The question is, what does that mean for 2024, right? Look, let's say everyone decides to get a roommate, right? And you had this big burst of household formation that drove up shelter prices, and now people decide to get a roommate, and that, weakens household formation, and now shelter costs go down. You're still left with this idea around the labor market, right? I mean, for whatever reason, okay, the Fed views the labor market as the conduit for achieving their inflation objectives. That is the principal issue right now. Powell keeps talking about pain and rebalancing the labor market. If that is what the Fed is trying to achieve, they're not doing it, okay? They're not doing it. And that's why I think maybe where Connor and I disagree a little bit is, what does that mean for the interest rate outlook in the back half of the year? And let's just keep in mind, right? I mean, there is a good reason. I mean, I think there's a pretty, you can make a pretty